Tariffs are one of President Trump's favorite tools, but also one of the most misunderstood. They sound simple: tax foreign goods, bring back American jobs. But in reality, they can help some workers while hurting others. So, who actually pays them, and do they really bring back jobs to the US? Let's break it down. Tariffs are a tax on products that are imported into a country. Who pays that tax? Well, it's complicated. Trump would want you to believe that other countries are paying for it. His opponents want you to believe that consumers in the US pay it. Really, it's a mixed bag. If a company fears that the increased prices will mean fewer people will buy its products, they may decide to cover some of that increased cost themselves. That company may be the importer, the middleman in the US, who will pay the cost. The company itself may be in the US and just have stuff manufactured in another country. And to that degree, it is US corporations paying some of the tax. But ultimately, some of the cost increase usually gets passed on to the buyers at the store. A recent study by Goldman Sachs found over half of the cost of tariffs are paid by consumers. So, why are we not seeing more inflation as a result? A couple possibilities include that companies are at least temporarily absorbing most of the cost increases. Another is that because companies shipped more goods over before and in preparation for increased tariffs, they're still working through their extra inventory. But really, we just don't know. So what are the purposes of tariffs? There are a few things they can be used for. They can provide money to the government. They can encourage people to buy goods made in the US, which will mean there's incentive to create more US manufacturing jobs, since now the more expensive US goods become cheaper compared to the alternative. They can encourage businesses to move manufacturing operations to the US. They can encourage people to not buy from certain countries that we want to create some economic pain for. They can create pressure on other countries to reduce tariffs on us, or they can pressure other countries to do other things we want. Except for the higher prices for consumers, it sounds pretty great, right? Well, it depends on a few things. Do they create more jobs for the US? Well, evidence indicates that for the most part, tariffs haven't led to many new manufacturing jobs in most sectors. There were a few thousand steel-making jobs added because of tariffs which targeted steel from other countries, but aside from that, tariffs led to higher input costs and retaliatory tariffs from the other countries, which meant that there wasn't much benefit for most manufacturing jobs. A study from the Federal Reserve found an overall decrease in manufacturing as a result from the tariffs in 2018 and 2019. For example, tariffs on things like steel meant that it is more expensive then for a company that uses steel, whether imported or bought in the US, to make their products. Higher prices mean consumers will buy less of their product, and the company may have to lay off workers. The same thing happens with any input material. Any US company that uses a tariffed product to then make their product is going to be hurt, even if it's just a beekeeper buying honey bears to put his honey in to sell. Furthermore, if a manufactured product has multiple inputs that are tariffed, it could become cheaper to assemble the product outside of the United States and then just ship the completed item in. However, we don't yet know the full effect of the 2025 tariffs, which have been much larger and wider reaching. Many companies have pledged to increase their manufacturing capacity in the US, and if they live up to those pledges, and if the new jobs outweigh the jobs lost as a result of higher input costs, then some of the tariffs, the ones that actually led to more US manufacturing, could be positive. But for many products, manufacturing in the US would be too expensive to be worth it. And it isn't like we have enough workers to fill the jobs if all the manufacturing for tariff items was moved here. This is why the other reasons behind tariffs may be a better argument for them. But regardless, another big problem is created for employers regardless of the intent of the new tariffs. It's that with tariffs changing so much and so often based on the decisions of the president alone, businesses don't know how to plan. This affects their ability to successfully operate and can lead to lower profits and layoffs. It also means that it's harder for a business to decide if it's worth it to buy US-made goods or move manufacturing to the US. Now, when possible, I like to propose some policy suggestions. I think that tariffs can be used well if properly tailored for the desired goals. Therefore, my first policy suggestion to the president would be to be more clear with the goals. Some tariffs are helpful to some goals and harmful to others. I'm not going to cover all the goals, but first, let's address the goal of pressuring other countries to reduce tariffs on us. Since tariffs can be used by a country to protect its manufacturing industry, we need to ask ourselves if it might be better in the long run to let another country grow its manufacturing base. I think that it would be better for the US and the world as a whole to let certain countries in Africa and Latin America increase their prosperity by establishing manufacturing in their countries. That is often a necessary step in growing a country's economy. Increased prosperity in these countries would likely mean fewer wars, less terrorism, and better trade opportunities for us in the future. On the other hand, there are some countries which are already somewhat prosperous and/or who we have a significant trade deficit with. For these countries, retaliatory tariffs make sense to me. Second, for the goal of increasing government funding. The 10% base tariff that President Trump imposed in addition to retaliatory tariffs and product-specific tariffs makes most sense for this goal. It may or may not be a good idea economically, and it could hurt those same countries I was mentioning we should help, but for a government income source, an equal base tariff is pretty straightforward. Third, the goal of pressuring countries to do what we want. For example, the goal of pressuring China to stop devaluing its currency. This is a worthwhile goal, and tariffs may help. If you don't know what I'm talking about, this is when another country, like China, purposely manipulates its currency values to make it cheaper for a country to export goods and more expensive to import. This contributes to our trade deficit with countries like China. Another way we could potentially use tariffs is to pressure countries to create or raise minimum wages. This would make it more expensive for companies to make things in that country, and some might move operations to the US. At the very least, it would raise the standard of living in that country, especially for the poorest. But in another example, President Trump has enacted tariffs on Brazil to punish them for prosecuting and convicting their former president, Bolsonaro, who was President Trump's personal ally. You see, after Bolsonaro lost his election, he tried to coup to stay in power. President Trump tried to pressure Brazil to drop the charges by raising tariffs from 10% to 50%, and they've stayed in place even after Bolsonaro was convicted. The fourth goal, protecting our industries. To use tariffs effectively for this goal, we need to carefully apply them only to industries which are particularly important for our economy or which are important to our national security and are at risk of not being obtainable internet. A fourth goal, protecting our industries. To use tariffs effectively for this goal, we need to carefully apply them only to industries which are particularly important for our economy or which are important to our national security and are at risk of not being obtainable internally or from our nearby allies like Canada. If the industry isn't at risk, then we have to consider if the tariffs are likely going to create enough new jobs to offset the increased input costs that could also hurt critical industries. With many raw materials like steel and aluminum, it's tricky. We want to make sure we keep that sector alive in the US so that it, combined with what we could get from our allies, would meet our needs if a major war ever broke out. But if we go beyond that, these products are inputs in so many things that benefits would likely be outweighed by the higher prices and decreased demand for everything made with US steel and aluminum. So part of the equation comes down to economies of scale. This is when you can make a product cheaper because you are making more of it. If tariffs can lead to the growth of a sector to the point where the US-made goods become cheaper than it was before, and not just cheaper by comparison with that from a tariff country, then that can also help offset any harm. Last, the goal of increasing US manufacturing. I've already touched on some aspects of this, but with this goal we need to consider how equipped we actually are to make a particular tariff product in the US at a relatively competitive price. Cheaper products that are not produced at large scale, such as drinks, paper towels, etc., are usually not worth producing in a country with higher wages. Also, we need to consider if we have enough capable workers actually looking for work that could manufacture all these things we tariff in the US. In the end, tariffs can have their uses. The challenge for policymakers isn't just deciding whether to use tariffs, but understanding why they're using them and what trade-offs come with that choice. If we really want to strengthen American industry and improve global fairness, we'll need a strategy that's guided more by long-term goals than by political headlines. The more we understand how these policies work, the better chance we have at holding leaders accountable and finding real solutions that work for everyone. If you'd like to see more breakdowns that look at both sides of political and economic issues, please like and subscribe. And if I left something important out, share it in the comments. That's how we all learn and how we start building bridges. Thanks for watching. I'm Bridge Builder M.